Behind the grand facades of sprawling plantations, where whitewashed columns gleamed in the southern sun and meticulously trimmed gardens whispered of prosperity, a different story lingered in the shadows. Overgrown paths wound between shuttered cabins and crumbling brick chimneys, the air thick with a silence that seemed to guard secrets too filthy to admit. Behind these walls, unspeakable acts unfolded, acts that history barely dared to record, yet which defined the lives of those trapped within. The enslaved moved quietly, their labor unceasing, their voices suppressed by fear and law. What horrors occurred in the shadows of wealth and power? What stories were buried alongside the bones of those who had no choice? These were not the tales told in polite society. These were the dark histories, the dirty, hidden truths of exploitation, coercion, and obsession that festered behind plantation walls, invisible to the world outside. In the 18th and 19th centuries, plantations stretched across the American South, the Caribbean, and colonial outposts worldwide. From the outside, they were symbols of affluence, order, and culture. Majestic houses rose above neat lawns, servants' quarters were discreetly tucked away, and laws reinforced a rigid hierarchy that elevated the planter and subjugated the enslaved. Yet, beneath this veneer of civility, plantations were prisons where human beings were property, controlled in every aspect of life, and silenced under penalty of death, mutilation, or punishment. Men and women of African descent were bought, sold, and treated as commodities, their value measured in work, obedience, and reproductive capacity. On paper, these estates were emblems of prosperity. In practice, they were theaters of domination where cruelty mutated, sometimes subtly, sometimes monstrously. And in the heart of these elegant homes, the most intimate abuses were hidden secrets that polite history would ignore for centuries. Chains on the wrists were visible, but chains on the soul were far more binding. Enslaved people endured relentless labor in the fields, constant surveillance in the quarters, and arbitrary punishments meted out without warning. Yet, within the domestic sphere, the dynamic of power was more insidious. White women, ostensibly restrained by social norms, exercised a different kind of authority, often exploiting the men under their control in ways that left invisible scars. White men dominated the public eye with overt violence and intimidation. White women mastered the private manipulation of desire, obedience, and fear. Behind closed doors, these women could summon terror, craft humiliations, and enforce submission in ways that left no trace on ledgers but etched themselves deeply into the psyches of the enslaved. Chains were not just iron. They were control over bodies, minds, and the most intimate corners of life. Yet what unfolded in those hidden rooms, attics, and chambers remained largely unspoken until painstaking historical investigation began to illuminate the shadows. The hidden chambers of the plantation were theaters of quiet terror. Diaries and letters, sometimes accidentally preserved, hint at psychological manipulation, subtle intimidation, and cruel games of dominance. In some cases, white mistresses exerted sexual power over enslaved men, a grim inversion of the public hierarchy that allowed private violations to flourish unchallenged. These were spaces where obedience became torture, where secrecy fueled corruption, and where the human body became a canvas for control. Some enslaved men were coerced into impossible compliance, their resistance punished in ways both physical and emotional. The psychological weight of knowing one's suffering could never be admitted, and that any hint of protest might provoke death or brutal reprisal, created a terror that was constant, intimate, and deeply isolating. The trauma endured by enslaved men cannot be overstated. Humiliation became routine. Dignity was eroded day by day. Fear was omnipresent, a silent master dictating every action, glance, and word. Familial bonds were strained, destroyed, or weaponized against those who might attempt to resist. The invisible wounds, carried silently, compounded with exhaustion and physical toil, left scars that endured far beyond the plantation walls. Every whispered command, every forced act of submission, every glance of appraisal or threat created echoes of suffering that would ripple across generations. Imagine a life where survival meant obeying in ways history refused to record, where each day demanded concessions of the body, spirit, and identity. For decades, these stories were buried. Polite society either denied them outright or reduced them to rumors and innuendo, the voices of the victims silenced by shame and intimidation. Yet historians, descendants, and scholars gradually began to unearth these hidden truths, letters tucked away in libraries, oral testimonies preserved in family memories, diaries once dismissed as trivial, favored status, once interpreted as benign attention, was re-examined as a grim mark of coercion. Slowly, painstakingly, the private crimes behind plantation walls were brought into the light. For centuries, the shadows were ignored, but the truth could not be buried forever. The revelation of these hidden abuses sent shockwaves through modern communities. Descendants confronted intergenerational trauma, piecing together fragments of stories passed down in hushed tones, oral histories never intended for the world to hear. Scholars emphasized the importance of acknowledging male victims, voices that had been almost entirely absent from traditional narratives of slavery. The public reaction was one of disbelief and discomfort, a confrontation with myths of white womanhood and genteel femininity that crumbled under the weight of truth. When the veil of civility is lifted, the ugly truths demand recognition, the psychological manipulation, the sexual coercion, the subtle but relentless assertion of dominance over those who had no means of defense. And yet, many still struggle to face the depth of these abuses, preferring instead the comforting fictions of a sanitized past. Power, when isolated and unchecked, often twists into abuse. Within the rigid patriarchal structures of plantations, white women were simultaneously oppressed and empowered. Restricted by social norms, they found avenues for authority through the bodies and obedience of enslaved men. The intersection of race, gender, and hierarchical dominance created a volatile space where frustration, desire, and control collided. Psychological analysis reveals a pattern. Dominance and coercion became coping mechanisms for those restricted by their own society, redirected toward the utterly powerless. The result was a system where cruelty was methodical, hidden, and personal, a silent epidemic of suffering enacted in rooms no one dared enter. History shows us that power, when left unchecked, breathes secrets too dark to speak aloud. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Can we understand cruelty without condoning it? Can we confront the reality of these abuses while maintaining our grasp of empathy and justice? And yet, even amid the horror, there are glimpses of resilience and quiet defiance. Enslaved men and women navigated these treacherous dynamics with incredible, if fragile, ingenuity. Survival meant learning to read moods, anticipate threats, and maintain a fragment of dignity amidst overwhelming degradation. Oral traditions, whispered stories, and coded acts of resistance became lifelines, preserving humanity in the face of unspeakable cruelty. Every small act of defiance, a glance, a whispered word, a refusal disguised as compliance, was a victory against the machinery of oppression. The plantation walls remembered these acts as much as they remembered the atrocities. In silence, they carried both the horror and the human spirit that endured it. As the sun filters through broken shutters and dust motes drift lazily through abandoned halls, the visual landscape mirrors the emotional weight of these stories. Empty rooms, broken furniture, and splintered doors are not merely relics of decay. They are witnesses to the abuses, the manipulations, and the hidden tragedies that occurred behind closed doors. The walls themselves seem to whisper the secrets they have held for centuries, urging the living to listen, to learn, and to remember. To confront history is to honor the voices that were silenced. To acknowledge the past is to prevent its repetition. The secrets behind plantation walls were nasty, dirty, and hidden, yet they demand to be heard. They challenge us to face the darkest corners of human behavior, to recognize the enduring consequences of unchecked power, and to acknowledge the suffering of those who were never meant to have a voice. Every letter unearthed, every testimony recorded, and every oral story reclaimed chips away at centuries of enforced silence. These revelations are uncomfortable, disturbing, and heart-wrenching, yet they are essential to understanding the full scope of history, not just the sanitized versions taught in classrooms, but the raw, unvarnished reality of Black lives under slavery. Even now, the echoes linger. Descendants carry the hidden legacy of trauma and resilience, navigating a world that too often glosses over the personal, intimate horrors endured by their ancestors. Every step taken to reveal these truths illuminates the intersection of human cruelty, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of survival. The narrative of slavery is not complete without these voices, these experiences, and the dark lessons embedded in private rooms, secluded attics, and the forbidden chambers of plantations. Listening to the shadows is a moral imperative, an act of remembrance, and a form of justice. The walls remember what we pretend never happened. They remember the manipulation, the coercion, the emotional and physical torment that cannot be erased. They remember the survival strategies, the quiet rebellions, and the small sparks of dignity preserved in an oppressive system designed to strip humanity from every soul it touched. To honor these stories is to honor the countless men and women who endured, resisted, and survived the unspeakable horrors hidden behind wealth and status. History is not merely a record of events, it is the vessel for memory, empathy, and understanding, carrying the weight of lives that must never be forgotten. In the end, the secrets behind plantation walls were more than just tales of cruelty. They were a reflection of a society obsessed with control, privilege, and appearance. They were nasty, hidden, and filthy truths that linger in the shadows of wealth and power. And now, with the light of history finally illuminating them, these truths demand recognition, reflection, and a reckoning that spans generations. We are compelled to confront these horrors not just to remember the past, but to understand the forces that shaped it, to recognize the scars left behind, and to ensure that the voices of the silence continue to resonate in our collective memory.